Shasha, terrific turnout for this remarkable book. We have Jairam here, and I'll turn to him in just a second. But since some of you may be wondering who Janaki Ram is, she is the grandniece of V.K. Krishna Menon. She lives in America, writes, and visits Kozhikode every once in a while, where she actually has a home. But I'm going to turn to Jairam, and I invite you, Janaki, the mic is there. You can also chip in whenever you like on some of these things. One of the most extraordinary things, there was a little comment in somebody's article recently that a good thing about the Congress Party's repeated defeats is that Shashi Tharoor and Jairam Ramesh have published good books. The truth is that I will proudly yield place to Jairam. He's written his last three particularly are the ones I've read. The book on Indira Gandhi and nature, which could not have been more timely given the increasing despair in the world about climate change and the environment. And one forgets that she was one of the very few heads of government at Stockholm to first ring the alarm bells for the world on the environment. Then his book on P.N. Huxer, whom I had the privilege of meeting only at the fag end of his career, but an extraordinary person. Actually, the two of them have a slight resemblance, I should think. But anyway, he's written a very interesting book on Huxer. And then, both of those were reasonably slender volumes. You could digest them in an evening. But then he's turned his attention to this monumental work, a checkered brilliance, the many lives of V.K. Krishna Menon. And I have to say, first of all, hats off to Jairam, because it is a prodigious feat. Just the amount of research he has done, the amount of original material he has come up with that none of us perhaps even knew existed. And the sheer length and scope and depth of the book is really a monumental work. It's hard to imagine anything about V.K. Krishna Menon and his times that could come close to this. It's a spectacular achievement. Congratulations, Jairam.
Thank you, Shashi, and I'm delighted that the MP of Thiruvananthapuram is releasing this book, who used to be a member of Thiruvananthapuram MP. The only difference was that Shashi can campaign in Malayalam,
That's right.
and Krishna Menon campaigned only in English.
Very true. In fact, when I first came down there, people said, are you also going to be like Krishna Menon and only campaign in English? And I said, no, I think it's better that I manage in my modest Malayalam, which has got a little less modest over the years. But I think the days when you could campaign in English anywhere in India are over. Krishna Menon won in Bombay campaigning in English. He won in Kerala campaigning in English. In between, he won in Midnapore in West Bengal campaigning in English. So it's quite an amazing, if unusual, political career. But Jairam describes himself as an archival biographer, which is very interesting in that what he has done is to delve into the archives and let them speak for themselves. He has chosen, I think rightly, to describe the subject of his biography as completely and fully as possible from the point of view of people close to him, family members, the point of view of strangers, the point of view of spies, because every intelligence agency in the Western world maintained a file on Krishna Menon. So there were files that he was able to find, correspondence, particularly with Nehru, which is another big theme in the book. And from that, he doesn't either eulogize Krishna Menon. This is not a hagiography. This is not something that merely praises the man, exceptional though he was, nor is it a series of castigations. Because, for many people, Krishna Menon's stupendous achievements are often forgotten, and he's associated principally with the defeat of the Indian army in the war with China in '62, and those people can't see any good in Krishna Menon. What Jairam has done is to bring it all out. And what's striking is that he has taken the whole life with him. Now, that's enough from me, because what I really want to do is provoke Jairam into telling you the story that he tells. And as I said, Janaki, please chip in, especially when there is family law that can complement things that he's saying. So Jairam, you start off, it's a chronological biography, by the way. He starts off birth, not that far from Kozhikode, education and migration. What comes across about Krishna Menon, the human being, from those early years?
Well, birth actually in Kozhikode. He was born in Calicut, studied and grew up in Tellicherry, and then went off to see the world, mostly in London and Delhi and other world capitals. So very much, and finally comes home in 71 to contest his final election. And Calicut is one of the 3 places in the world which has a statue of Krishna Menon, the other 2 being London and New Delhi. I think, as Shashi has pointed out, that it was not my intention to make Krishna Menon a hero or a villain. There have been books which have extolled Krishna Menon and made him a hero. There have been books which have demonized Krishna Menon and made him a villain. But I wanted to understand the man, his achievements, both before 1947 and after 1947. We tend to neglect his pre-1947 achievements and tend to focus exclusively on what he did after 1947. So that's one objective. And the second objective really was to understand his times, the political history of India's independence movement, the political history of India's first 15 years following independence, particularly when Jawaharlal Nehru was the Prime Minister and Krishna Menon was his ideological soulmate, so to speak. So it was, and Krishna Menon left behind tens of thousands of pages of notes, of letters, of memos, of his scribbles, often, most often indecipherable, except by some of his family members like Janaki. And these were available, these were declassified, these were made open for public scrutiny in February of this year at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. And so this is a story not of me saying of Krishna Menon, because it's Krishna Menon emerging from his own written material of a career that spanned over half a century. So there were many surprises, there were many shocks, there were many revelations, but I think at the end, what I have tried to do is to do an honest job, a man of monumental achievements in every sphere, but also a man who had gigantic failures, of which certainly 1962 was the most tragic reflection, and we can discuss that a little later.
We should, but as we start off with the early years, what comes across to you about the young Krishna Menon as a human being, from what you see of his family's letters, his letters, that whole, I found that chapter particularly unusual and interesting.
You see, one thing that I've tried to highlight in this book is the role of 2 of Krishna Menon's sisters, who were very important players in his life.
Both elder.
J. Devika, who's a feminist scholar at the CDS in Thiruvananthapuram, has written that very often in Kerala's society, the brilliance of men gets highlighted, but the brilliance of women tends to get hidden. And in Krishna Menon's life, his eldest sister, Chinnamalu Amma, a polyglot who knew many languages, fiercely independent, also eccentric in some ways, an author who writes about reform of the matrilineal system in the early 1910s, and in 1948 writes an article on Sheikh Abdullah. And she was one of the first Indians to write an article on Sheikh Abdullah and saying that the future of Kashmir lies in India, but the future of Kashmir lies as long as Sheikh Abdullah, is supported. And Sheikh Abdullah remains committed to the vision of Gandhi and Nehru. Here was this extraordinary woman, and of course his sister, the other sister, Janaki Amma, who was, I think, his closest emotional ballast, so to speak, over his entire life, with whom he shared his life's achievements, his life's failures, write to her regularly, and whom he made, gave the power of attorney in 1935 to make her, so to speak, the carnival of the family. And that showed the important role that these 2 sisters, which have often tend to get forgotten in the life of Krishna Menon.
Janaki, within the family, what was the perception of him? Was he regarded as some sort of giant above criticism, or was their family talk about him as a member of the family?
I think he was considered more as a bumbling person within the family, because there were so many brilliant people, including the two sisters. I don't think we gave much. We didn't actually laud him for his intelligence. He was not considered the most brilliant person in the family.
How amazing.
Actually, his sisters were considered to be far more intellectually, brilliant than him. His brilliance comes out much later. But as in the first 20 years of his life, his sister, who is two sisters actually, who are academically. In fact, one sister who dies tragically very young, studying medicine in Madras then, is often considered to be the most brilliant member of the family.
But she's the one who just broke off from the family, no?
No, that's the eldest sister.
Eldest
Jina
sister.
Maluma, yeah.
And she just broke off, and that was
She
the
just
end.
broke off. She wanted her independence. She wanted her settlement. And as I said, but she kept on writing. And she writes a letter to Nehru in 1957,
Oh, yes, that's
when Nambudripad government comes to power. And she says, Mr. Prime Minister, do you know that this communist government in Kerala is doing land reforms? And what is going to happen to all the lands I have? And Nehru patiently, replies to her saying that your constitutional rights to your land bequeathed to you by your father will be fully protected. So there is this, she was a fiercely independent woman. And I think that's a very important aspect of Krishna Menon's personality that often gets forgotten in all the books that get written about him.
So he comes from this very brilliant family, and then he goes off to England to study.
No, before he goes off to England, there is a very important influence in his life, which is Annie Besant.
Annie Besant.
See, Annie Besant is a forgotten figure of Indian political history. In the pre-Gandhi phase of Indian politics, the most charismatic figure of Indian politics was Annie Besant. Here was this Irish woman who comes to India in the 1880s, settles down in Adyar, and is making Indians aware of the glory of Indian culture, extolling Hinduism, extolling Buddhism, and almost all Indians become besotted with her. Jawaharlal Nehru joins the Theosophical Society at the age of 13. Krishna Menon is a member of the Theosophical Society too. And Annie Besant actually discovers two Krishnas. She discovered Jiddu Krishnamurti, the great philosopher, and she discovers Krishna Menon, who subsequently, of course, has this great career. So Annie Besant is the person really who plays a very important role in the pre-London phase, and she has a role in sending him to London to teach in a Theosophical Society school. Krishna Menon goes to London for 6 years, but doesn't come back for 29 years. For 6 months, and he stays for 29 years. And he comes back to India only after 29 years.
That's right. These things happen, of course. I went to the UN for 1 year, and I came back after 29. So I know the feeling. But actually, I have three things in common, Krishna Menon. The being MP for Thiruvananthapuram, I'm very proud about, and this great predecessor. But I'm equally addicted to tea as he was. He used to drink about 20 cups of tea a day. I come pretty close. Though he would also have buns with them, which I don't.
But there's a wonderful, everything in this book is written evidence. I have not recounted the many stories of Krishna Menon. But one very famous story of Krishna Menon, which I must relates to our concerns are, Shashi this evening. Apparently Shashi's father was in hospital and he was recovering from a heart attack. And Krishna Menon goes to visit Chandran Tharoor and he says, I say, Chandran, what are you doing in bed? So Mr. Tharoor says, I've had a heart attack. So Krishna Menon says, oh, that's the first time I've discovered you have a heart.
Which I did not find funny. I was 10 years old at the time, or 12.
That's typical Krishna Menon.
It was typical Krishna. That's the only time I ever met him was in Breach Candy Hospital in Bombay when he was pulling that stunt on my father. But my father had known him as a student in London and had actually not only helped him volunteering at the India League, But then when he became High Commissioner, they founded something called the India Club. And the India Club, which, by the way, has recently lost a battle to preserve its heritage status in London, is a little place where Indians of not very great means would get together to have endless cups of tea, doshas, idlis, that sort of stuff, on the Strand. And which, as you know, is a pretty fancy address, but in a pretty seedy building. So that was the third connection I was going to mention, was through my father. And my father and he stayed in touch for many years. And to my undying regret, when I went to St. Stephen's College in '72, my father said, you have to call on Krishna Menon. And I kept procrastinating, and Krishna Menon said, when are you going to come? He wasn't even living very far away, but you know how it is. And then I woke up one morning to the horrifying news that he'd passed away. He passed away in '74. So I never actually met him when I was old enough to have been able to get more out of the conversation with him. That's why reading Jairam's book is a special satisfaction for me, because I get to know this man whom my father knew well and I never got a chance to know. But coming back to the book, Jairam, so Krishna Menon stays on for these 29 years, essentially to lead, become the voice of the Indian independence struggle in London. Now, this is in some ways an unusual thing, because there were lots of Indian luminaries coming to study in England, etc., going back. In a sense, it's because he didn't go back that he rose to that preeminence, right? He became head of the India League, or the Commonwealth India League as it first was. He cultivated an enormous amount of, enormous number of impressive British intellectuals, from Bertrand Russell to Harold Lasky. He became the Indian to know in London. When Jawaharlal Nehru, who hadn't yet met him, was visiting London in the mid-30s, he wrote to Krishna Menon saying, will you arrange my program? Tell us about that and how Krishna Menon got to that stage.
Well, you know, the pre-1947 Krishna Menon came as a complete revelation to me. And it's half the book is pre-47 Krishna Menon, because he had this, he was the India League, the spokesman of Indian independence, the sole spokesman of the Indian National Congress, Nehru's voice, so as it were, a borough councillor, is like being a ward member for 14 years in London.
St. Pancras.
And very often forgotten, the founder of Penguin Books and founder of Pelican Books, which, you know, today is, you know, very interestingly, Penguin has published this book. And it's a company that was founded by Krishna Menon in 1935. So he had a publishing career. He studied law, didn't have much of a legal career, but in one case, he was the counsel, and that case was the Udham Singh case. And Udham Singh, as you know, was the man who assassinated Sir Michael O'Dwyer of the Jallianwala Bagh infamy. And Udham Singh was brought to trial, and Krishna Menon was so effective in his defense of Udham Singh that Udham Singh was executed within 48 hours of his trial. So not much of a lawyer, but he got a law degree. He probably has the record of having been the longest ever student at the London School of Economics. He was a student for 10 years, from 1924 to 1934.
And he wasn't allowed to submit his thesis.
You know, the director tried to get rid of him, but he kept coming back because he had impressed Harold Lasky, who was the second of his mentors, so much that Lasky kept him on as an MSc student, as a PhD student, and William Beveridge, the director of the LSE, thought that the Krishna Menon was contaminating the LSE with the communist virus and tried his best to get rid of him, but he didn't. So he had this career in the LSE. He was a publisher, he was an editor, he was a borough councillor, but most importantly, he was the spokesman for Indian independence. As somebody had written about him, which I have quoted, Krishna would go to any corner of England to speak to a man and a dog in favor of Indian independence. And I think that was a remarkable achievement. You know, all Indian history textbooks teach us that the Indian freedom movement was essentially a freedom movement fought in India. That's true. But there was another strand to the Indian freedom movement, which was negotiations between the Indian National Congress and the Labour Party. And in those negotiations, which lasted over 12 years, Krishna Menon was a pivotal figure. because of his relationship with Lasky, his relationship with Stafford Cripps, and his relationship with Clement Attlee.
Yeah, these were very important. Sorry, Janaki, go ahead.
No, I wanted to.
Keep it close to you, it's fine.
I don't think people know about his pre-independence success. And I think Jairam has done a remarkable job in bringing out his role prior to independence and how important his job in England was for India to get independence when it did, because Labour Party put Indian independence on the manifesto in 1946. And that is something most people don't know. And I don't know if we would have got independence in 47 if that had not been on the platform and Labour had not come back.
I think the only party in England that was supporting Indian independence in the 30s and 40s was the British Communist Party. And that's why Krishna Menon acquired this reputation of being a communist, because he used the British Communist Party as a pulpit to propagate Indian independence. And Janaki is absolutely right. The fact that Indian independence came on the agenda of the Labour Party in the mid-30s and continued thereafter was entirely Krishna Menon's contribution. And from 1933 onwards, Shashi, Krishna Menon is bombarding Nehru with ideas for a constituent assembly. Not many people in India want a constituent assembly. Gandhi is not very enamored of the idea of a constituent assembly. Only Nehru is agreeing with Krishna Menon. And finally, as you know, Gandhi changes his mind, and after change of mind of Gandhi, the Constituent Assembly becomes a reality in 1946. Today, every leader, every student is reading the preamble of the Constitution in the protests. Now, guess who wrote the preamble of the Constitution? It was our man, Vengalan Krishna Menon. It was he who drafted the preamble, and the word independent sovereign republic that figures in the preamble is his contribution. So he plays a very important role in the establishment of the Constituent Assembly, in the drafting of the preamble. He gives a lot of ideas on the Constitution, but then, he becomes High Commissioner to London, and then he goes away. He is not a member of the Constituent Assembly. But there were other Menons to do that job. There was no shortage of Menons, Shashi, at that time. No. And Nehru's chief advisor was Krishna Menon. Sardar Patel's chief advisor was VP Menon. The Foreign Office was run by KPS Menon. And we had an ambassador in China who was also a Menon of sorts, KM Panika. The Indian Intelligence Bureau was run by TG Sanjeevi Pillai. And our Commonwealth Office was run by Raghavan Pillai. So, Menons and Pillays predominated the government of India at the time that Krishna Menon was ruling the roost.
Absolutely. And in fact, it's remarkable when you think about how well known and respected all those people were, that he is the one in many ways who looms largest in the Indian imagination, even if he had begun to fade until Jairam resurrected him. And I think I'll move Jairam now to the post-independence phase, because that is where the story gets a little less, shall we say, admirable, because other problems start. As High Commissioner, he was very effective, by the way. There's a line that Jairam quotes Pamela Mountbatten writing that he is in manner more English than any Englishman, which is something we also forget, because you only remember the Krishna Menon we saw in India in his white munda and jubba and his manner here. But in England, he was always immaculately dressed in suits and was very, very English in his manner and intonation and speech and graciousness. But quite apart from all that, he comes, apart from being High Commissioner, he is very, very close to Nehru. And one of the sub-themes of this book, I would argue, is the bromance between the two of them. Because there is an extraordinary fraternal relationship. Krishna Menon has some depressive episodes and even some hypochondriac episodes, and Nehru's letters to him when he's going through real or imagined bouts of ill health, very, very touching. But Krishna Menon has a lot of influence on Nehru from the time they meet in London in 35. And from then onwards, you're seeing this kind of influence right up to the point when Krishna Menon persuades Nehru to let him come in and contest for Parliament and become become a politician. But before we get to the politician stage, I'd like Jairam to address briefly his extraordinarily brilliant career as an international diplomat. We forget that there were so many issues in which India's voice counted, and the voice was carried by Krishna Menon.
Well, in the 50s, Krishna Menon was known as Formula Menon. Whenever there was a problem in any part of the world, Krishna Menon would be consulted. The Americans hated him. The Britishers disliked him. The Russians were suspicious of him. The Chinese were not members of the United Nations. But they all respected his intellect. And they knew when there was a problem, the man to find the solution was Krishna Menon, and that's why he was called Formula Menon. Indochina, 1954. Korea, 1953. Algeria, Cyprus, Suez, you name it. Any problem, the crux of the solution was Krishna Menon's interventions. Now, I think that was the high point of Krishna Menon. In 1955, he meets Chou Enlai for 8 days in China. And then he goes to Washington and meets Eisenhower twice. And then he meets John Foster Dulles 6 times. Imagine an envoy of Nehru meeting the American Secretary of State 6 times in 6 months. And he almost accomplished what Kissinger accomplished in 1971, which is a rapprochement between the US and China. So this was the high point of the Nehruvian era, of which Krishna Menon was the international embodiment, the international symbol.
One triumph in that context was the 55 release of those American pilot
He
shots.
got 4 American airmen released in China, and that was a huge success for him. In the peace, the ceasefire in Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, the armistice agreement in Korea, in the Korean Peninsula. So there are a number of success stories. And even as High Commissioner Shashi, Nehru did not want India to remain in the Commonwealth. The Congress party was deeply suspicious of India remaining in the Commonwealth, but it was Krishna Menon actually who ultimately prevailed upon Nehru to have the Commonwealth. In fact, if I rewind a little, partition, both Patel and Nehru were deeply, deeply ambivalent about the partition. They were not keen on the partition at all. And Maulana Azad writes in his unpublished memoirs, which was made public only in 1988, 30 years after his death, that the man who made Nehru's mind up for him on partition was this evil man called Krishna Menon. So Krishna Menon actually, the man who proposed partition was VP Menon, and the man who sold partition to Nehru was Krishna Menon.
All right, don't blame us for everything, Jairam, come on.
So this was meningitis.
But he was, Jairam told us he was a 10-year-long student. He was described by one of his American contemporaries as a perpetual student in a perpetual rage. And he wasn't actually, if you're always in a rage, you wouldn't be a great diplomat. So he wasn't always in a rage, but he turned it on quite often. And of course, he turned on the charm, particularly with young ladies, which were very polite and covering. He had a huge female fan following. And this is something which again is, in those days, the media was a little more polite. And there weren't social media to send photos of Krishna Menon with a female
But I think
followers.
one thing that united Nehru and Krishna Menon, both of them had huge female fan followings.
And in fact, Meenu Masani...
Both national and international.
And Meenu Masani wrote of the India League under Krishna Menon, it was a one-man and many women army. But anyway, coming back to the modern, so the diplomacy we've covered, one thing Jairam hasn't mentioned, I'm sure he will on the future occasion, it was Krishna Menon. The one fact you all know about Krishna Menon is his 8-hour marathon speech on Kashmir at the UN Security Council, in the course of which he even fainted and they had to adjourn while he was taken to hospital and revived. And then he came back and continued for 8 hours and 56 minutes or so.
Well, before you go to Kashmir, I want to say something, because all of you are in Kerala, Krishna Menon is a demigod, right? Well, I have to disappoint you. In 1955, when the states reorganization was being considered, Krishna Menon is writing letters to Nehru saying, do not create a separate state of Kerala. Do not be fooled, taken in by this Malayali. You know who that Malayali was? K.M. Panika. He was a member of the States Reorganization Commission. And he kept telling Nehru, if you set up independent Kerala, or separate Kerala, Kerala will become a communist bastion. It will become a communist citadel. Do not create Kerala. And he goes on to tell Nehru, if you create an independent Madras, Madras will become a bastion of separatism and linguistic fanaticism. So his solution was Dakshin Pradesh, which is today's Tamil Nadu, parts of Karnataka, parts of Andhra, and all of Travancore, all of Cochin, and all of Malabar. This was what his solution was. Luckily, Nehru did not listen to Krishna Menon. There were some occasions in which Nehru believed that Krishna Menon was too much of a romantic and too unrealistic, and this was one such occasion. The second occasion, all the communists love Krishna Menon. But Krishna Menon supported Nehru in the dismissal of the EMS Nambudripad government in 1959. He did not oppose it. In fact, he became the channel through which all Congress leaders vented their grievances to Nehru. And he went along with the dismissal of Nambudripad. And it is ironical that the man who did most to keep Krishna Menon's memory alive after his death was a minister in Nambudripad's government, Justice V.R. Krishnaiyer. And he became, he was responsible in many ways for the statue of Krishna Menon, the road being named after Krishna Menon in Delhi. So he had, even though people were opposed to him, people saw his essential value in terms of his sheer brain power and intellectual capability.
I'm being told we have to quickly open it up to the audience, and we haven't even got to the crucial final stage. Two things very quickly, Jairam, that I'll have to ask you to summarize. We were getting to it slowly, we'll get to it fast now. One is the whole business of the relationship with the army when he was made defense minister. And having become defense minister, as you remember, he had a very fraught relationship with General Thimaya. And you've described his own role in provoking General Thimaya's resignation and the frustrations of the army that led to the defeat in the war with China in '62. I'm sorry, that will be the last question I can ask Jairam, so we'll get some questions from you after that. I'm sorry?
Sorry?
We can't hear you, but just tell the organizers what the issue is, and I'm sure they can. I'm sorry? Oh, this is from another venue. I beg your pardon. Carry on, Jairam.
Okay.
Yes,
Well, very quickly so that we can open it up to the audience. On '62, Krishna Menon is more sinned against than sinning. I think all the story of '62 came out from the view of the armed forces, the generals and the brigadiers, and they painted Krishna Menon in the darkest possible colors. And I think the truth is incredibly more complex. And right from '59 onwards, the relationship between Krishna Menon and the generals is becoming more and more tense, and not just for what Krishna Menon did, but also because for what the armed forces themselves were doing. It's extraordinary that Thimaya resigns, and the news of his resignation is leaked as an exclusive story to one newspaper in Delhi, The Statesman, and it is leaked by the number 3 or number 4 in the army, General J.N. Chaudhary, who was then moonlighting as the military correspondent of The Statesman. It's quite extraordinary. And so there are many such episodes. Malcolm MacDonald, who is the British High Commissioner, Thimaya is telling Malcolm MacDonald, Krishna Menon is plotting a coup. He wants to overthrow Nehru. Nothing can be more bizarre than this. And here's a serving army chief telling this to the British High Commissioner. Can you believe anything more bizarre than this happening. So all this was happening. But I think so, the short story on 62, Shashi, is that Krishna Menon was more sinned against than sinning. It's much more complex, and I think he became ultimately the scapegoat.
Yeah, I think if you have questions on that, we'll take it, but I have to now turn to the audience. So why don't I go first to the gentleman in the checkered shirt, right here, then we'll come this side, we'll go back and forth as time. I'll come to you next, after this gentleman. Where is the mic? Yeah, give it to him. Just pass it down that'll be simpler.
Sir, good evening. My question is nothing related to this talk.
But no, ask it related to the talk, please.
Okay.
I'm not here to talk about NRC, CA, and all that. We are talking only of Krishna Menon.
Not with NRC. Nothing.
Or
Is it
with
related
Congress
to Krishna
Party.
Menon?
No, not even party.
If it's related to Krishna Menon, yes.
Please
otherwise-
ask for Krishna Menon. That's all. I'm here only for the book, not for anything else.
Yeah, okay. So there's a hand on this side. Okay, you take it, go ahead. And then pass the mic to the other.
You can
young
ask
man.
me this question offline after this, okay?
So when V.K. Krishna Menon was in London, he was criticized for keeping Rolls-Royce as his official
Yes.
vehicle. Still, he liked to travel in double-door buses across London. So how do you remark this? This contrast between his, public appearance as a statesman and his personal asceticism.
So
Well,
that's a very good question. And
you-
you must explain why he wanted the
You know,
Rolls-Royce.
he wanted to buy the Rolls Royces and have the Rolls Royces to show the white man that the brown man is to his equal, that the brown man can also own Rolls Royces. That was his motivation. But, as you said, it was personal asceticism. He had a palatial bungalow as the residence of the High Commissioner, but he stayed in the High Commission, a separate floor in the High Commission, and today that bungalow is the residence of the Deputy High Commissioner. He never stayed in the official bungalow. And in fact, the Rolls Royce it was used in the funeral of Harold Lasky. It was used for ceremonial occasions, but he never used it. It was a political message that he was sending, that we may be a poor country, but we have dignity, and we can be your equal where it counts. That was important.
Okay, you have the mic here, young man? No? Okay, here. Then you take the mic to that young man. He raised his hand long.
He also wore
No shirt.
immaculately tailored Savile Row suits. Immaculately tailored. And that is what he wanted to show, that I'm more British than you, so don't mess around with me.
In fact, there's one episode that I didn't find in your book that my father used to tell me. There was this English woman who rather patronizingly complimented him on his English. And he apparently said, "Madam, my English is much better than yours. You merely picked it up. I learned it."
No, this episode is
Richard
there,
Brophy, it is there.
but like everything about Krishna Menon, it has got twisted.
Acha.
He didn't say it to a woman. He said it to the British delegate at the United Nations Security Council, Sir Patrick Running, and he told him, "Sir Patrick, you picked up your English on the street. I had to learn the English language."
Go ahead.
Sir, the question to respected Jairam Ramesh sir. Sir, how do you see the 370 article Kashmir in the background of
Krishna
Krishna
Menon was
Menon,
not
sir?
involved with that, was he? I don't think Krishna Menon.
Well, on Kashmir, there are long sections on Kashmir in this book. You know, one of the things of Krishna Menon in today's political context, and I will just say this is the only remark I'll make on Krishna Menon and related to today's politics. Krishna Menon was a dove when it came to China, but a hawk when it came to Pakistan. He believed that our problems with China can be negotiated and we should have a negotiated border settlement. If we had listened to Krishna Menon, we would not have had the war of 1962. Unfortunately, he was not listened to. On Pakistan, he had a more ideological position because he believed he was dead against partition. He came to partition out of, not out of conviction. He came to partition out of compulsion. And that's how he sold it to Nehru ultimately. And I think he never was able to forgive what Jinnah did in the creation of Pakistan, and that colored his approach to Pakistan. And in fact, Timaya, one of Timaya's criticisms of Krishna Menon was, he tells Malcolm MacDonald, my minister is fixated on Pakistan. Imagine an army chief today telling his minister, don't be fixated on Pakistan. But this was 1959.
Yes, young man. And we'll come to the lady in the blue next. Yeah.
So President Eisenhower has described V.K. Krishna Menon as a menace to the West. So how did this Krishna Menon, who rescued 4 American airmen, turn to this so-called menace to the West?
No, he was Mephistopheles to some people. He was different names to different people. The fact is, please understand, you must judge political personalities in the context of their times. You cannot use today's language, today's perspective to look at what political personalities have done in the past. Krishna Menon was a creature of the 40s and 50s. This was a new India that was emerging. It was a colonial India that was becoming independent. It was an India that was punching much above its economic power. It was an India not wanting to be part of the American world order or the Soviet world order. So that is why Krishna Menon was a man who was not accepted by virtually all sections of international opinion, because he was an independent man. He was thinking independently. And he was telling India and Indians, think independently for yourself. Don't become blind followers of the United States or the USSR. Although Krishna Menon, like Nehru, was willing to give the Britishers a benefit of doubt. You know, they were good Britishers, but they were true Indians. Ultimately, Britain for them, in fact, there is a wonderful line in the book which Krishna Menon's great regret was that America became a world power, that England did not become a world power. After the Suez misadventure of 1956, he basically recognizes that the era of UK, Pax Britannica, is over, and Pax Americana is becoming a reality. And that is what he and Nehru were deeply, deeply allergic to.
Yeah, he had some of the Englishman's superciliousness towards America, I'm sorry to say, of that era anyway. Yes, ma'am.
Very good afternoon to all the 3 speakers over here. I have 2 questions. First one is that he was considered the second most powerful political leader of that era, but he lost the limelight we don't discuss about him much. That is my first question, the reason behind it. And the second one is the reason why he resigned in 1967 from Congress and decided to be an independent candidate in the elections.
Back by the left.
Well, let me say that in 67, the Congress party denied him a ticket. In spite of Indira Gandhi's efforts, Kamaraj, S.K. Patil, and all the big bosses denied him a ticket. He didn't want to contest from Kerala. So in 1967, he contested as an independent. And let me tell you a story of 1967. I was a small boy, and Krishna Menon contested from the place where I was staying. That was the only time I have been, my first election rally I went to, and listened to Krishna Menon speak in English. And his entire election campaign in 1967 was run by the communists. And the Congress party had put up a candidate called S.G. Barve, and the entire campaign of the Congress candidate was run by the Shiv Sena. In 1967, we are now allies in 2019, but in 1967, Shiv Sena is running the campaign against Krishna Menon, because Shiv Sena was anti-South Indian at that time. They were anti-Malayali, anti-Madrasi, anti-Kannadiga, anti-Tamil. And Krishna Menon had 2 terms in Bombay, 57 and 62. And they wanted to get rid of Krishna Menon, and the Shiv Sena played a very important role in his defeat. In 69, then he becomes an independent candidate in Midnapur, as Shashi mentioned, and then in 71, he contests from Thiruvananthapuram. You know, your first question, he was not the second most powerful man. He was he was the second most photographed man, second most cartoonized man, second most publicized man, second most written about man. But he was not powerful in that sense of the term. His power derived from proximity to Nehru. That's it. No other power. His power was Nehru, Nehru and Nehru, and the strength of his ideas which appealed to Nehru. But Krishna Menon's greatest achievement in life was the manner in which he handled his loss of office. And this is a lesson for Shashi, it's a lesson for me, it's a lesson for everybody. How you conduct yourself when you are not in office, when you are not a minister, when you are not an MP, when you don't have power, when you don't have authority. Krishna Menon got dignity after 1962. And even his worst enemies became his best friends because he kept quiet, did not write any tell-all, kiss-all memoir, no book, did not go to any lit fest to say, what did I do in 1962? Did not do all that, just kept quiet. So dignity when you lose office is, I think, the hallmark of a successful public figure.
I also want to.
This is to
Yes, Janaki, please.
I remember my grandmother asking him why he didn't do anything to defend himself in 62. He said because it's not important to him and it would be to the detriment of the Prime Minister and the Congress party.
And that's exactly, I think the only qualification to what Jairam said is that, of course, when you lose office but your side is still in power, then you have to be reticent. But when you lose office and your entire side is in opposition and everyone is busy explaining themselves, you may be absolved. Yes, last question. I think.
this is to Mr. Tharoor. We know the heavy treasure of vocabulary you are having, and I'd like to know the one word to describe the personality of Krishna Menon.
Wow.
You know, on vocabulary, it is Shashi Tharoor. I yield to him.
I think mercurial would probably come closest. He was like Mercury. But having said that, I wanted to mention to that young man when he talked about the image of Krishna Menon, he was one of the very few Indians to ever grace the cover of Time magazine. But they made him look like a serpent, like a snake's head, and like the Indian cobra that he was supposed. And the illustration had a snake next to him as if to drive the message home. So that was the kind of, so he was famous and at the same time deeply resented and mistrusted in the West. Okay, last questions.
One question.
Yeah.
What is the reason you choose to run through the Krishna Menon life? Because what is the inspiration you choose this project? And what are the challenges you face to collect these kind of past information? Because information are very, very old one. 1940, 1950, around 60, 70 years past.
Very good question. Why Krishna Menon in 2019? Why resurrect him? I think a couple of reasons. First reason, of course, is what Shashi said. Narendra Modi's victory in 2014 has given Shashi and me more time to write books.
You more than me. I have a Lok Sabha constituency to worry about.
I hope we'll stop writing books in 2024. But if not sooner. But the important reason, I'm glad you raised this question. Krishna Menon is one of the most pivotal figures of the Nehruvian era. In the Nehruvian era, there is an age of Krishna Menon. You cannot understand Nehru and Nehru's foreign policy without understanding Krishna Menon's role. So that is one reason for looking at Krishna Menon. Number one. Number two, Krishna Menon plays a very important role in the pre-1947 period, as I have explained. Third, Krishna Menon has left behind tens of thousands of pages of primary material which can be used to write a biography. Most biographies in India, we either, as I said, we either praise or we demonize. But very few narrative biographies. So Krishna Menon is a very interesting figure. There is primary material. He plays a very important role in crucial episodes of India's defense policy and foreign policy. And the ghost of 1962 is still hovering around us. We are still reckoning and living with the legacy of 1962. So there are reasons for studying Krishna Menon.
Very, very true. And in fact, if I could add one more thing to what you said about his role, there's no question that he helped define many of what we today understand as Nehruvian principles and Nehruvian vision. In fact, on foreign affairs, a Canadian scholar called Michael Brecker published an entire book consisting nothing but interviews with Krishna Menon, but he called it something like India's view of the world, because he felt that Krishna Menon's views were India's views of the world, because that Nehru was in many ways inspired by the same views. All right, go ahead, sir.
So my first question is that Krishna Menon was pro-left, or he was left of center rather, and is it because of his influence of Nehru that Nehru was more towards the Soviet Union than to...
Both Nehru and Krishna Menon were democratic socialists, and both words are important. Many socialists are not Democrats. Almost all Democrats are not socialists. But Nehru and Krishna Menon were democratic socialists. All socialist regimes in the world have been non-democratic. India in 1947 was an experiment in democratic socialism. And both Krishna Menon and Nehru believed in that. And both were products of the British Fabian era. Both were products of, the Harold Lasky school of thought. Both were products of the thinking of the British left. So it is not that Krishna Menon influenced Nehru or Nehru influenced Krishna Menon. I think they were soulmates. They were a jugalbandi. They were singing the same raga. And the raga was democratic socialism. And they never abandoned that. They were not Marxists. They were not communists. In fact, Nehru offers Krishna Menon the post of ambassador to Moscow in 1952, and he refuses to go to Moscow. And there is a Scotland Yard report on Krishna Menon's meeting in the British Communist Party. The British government is very worried that Krishna Menon is becoming a communist, and Scotland Yard writes that Krishna Menon attends meetings of the British Communist Party, but he can never be a Marxist because he lacks the discipline to be one. He was not a communist. In fact, the communists supported him in 69 and 71. And Krishna Menon was asked, does this not prove you're a communist? So the reply was, no, it proves the communists love me. It does not prove that I love the communists. They have volunteered to support me. So they were both left of center, but they were both Democrats. Both believed in the parliamentary form of government.
You had a follow-up?
One more question.
I think Janaki was going to give a comment on the first one.
I was just going to tell you that in 1955, when my grandmother, we had property, and my grandmother said, is it true the communists might come to power? He said people like us would have to run away. So
In fact, that was very true. I didn't want to say it, but she has said it. One of his reasons why he was very, very uncomfortable with the Namboodiripad government was the policy of land reforms, land sealing, and thousands of acres had to be given away by his family as a consequence of those land reforms.
Exactly. Yes, go ahead.
One more question. Good afternoon.
This really will have to be the last, or I'm
Yes, sir.
going to be in serious trouble with the organizers. Last question.
1955, the Americans used Krishna Menon as an emissary for the release of captured airmen from Peking. It was Krishna Menon who secured that release.
Okay, listen, folks, I want you to all join me in an ovation for this wonderful book and its author, Jairam Ramesh, A Checkered Brilliance, The Many Lives of V.K. Krishna Menon, which we will now formally launch before you here in Kozhikode. It's the first Kerala launch of this book, is that right? Excellent. So, where is the book for launching? I got a note from the organizers saying we're going to do the book launch at 4:55. I'm Not even 1 minute late. On the dot. Come. Okay. Come, Janaki. You'll have to help unwrap the ribbon.